Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. This is a Ukraine War news update for the 19th of October 2023, the second part of my news videos. This will be a short one because there's not a great amount of military aid and geopolitical news to share with you. He says, knowing full well it'll last about an hour and a half because it always happens. No, it won't, honestly. So the White House will submit an additional request to Congress for funding aid to Ukraine and Israel. Although it's not yet been finalized, it's likely the US president will request the allocation of $60 billion to help Ukraine until September 2024. So this is really important. Okay, there's several aspects to this. One, they're packaging, or Biden's administration is hoping to package this assistance in with Israel assistance, which I think is $10 billion. It's a lot less, and assistance to other issues around the world, other sort of conflicts or similar types of scenarios. So it's packaging everything in one, and the idea is that if there's a lot of feeling for Israel in American politics, then that will get through, and that will allow the larger $60 billion assistance to Ukraine to be kind of ring fenced for the whole year, because that's till September 2024, rather than keeping on having to get different packages through Congress. This is one big package that can then be administered over time throughout the year. Really good idea. Hopefully it works. So the problem is there is no House Majority Speaker for the Republican Party because it's an absolute shit show. They had Kevin McCarthy, who was ousted by a small minority of rebels, and obviously the Democrats are going to vote like the GOP would vote against Democrats every day of the week. So you can't rely on the Democrats to vote for Republican speakers. Now, the issue there is that there's such a slim majority in the House of Representatives that the Republican Party are going to struggle to get anyone to replace Kevin McCarthy. In fact, there are theories abound that Kevin McCarthy could run and could get voted back in because there doesn't seem to be any other choice. At the moment, you've had Jim Jordan, who you definitely, if you support Ukraine, or as an American, if you are in agreement with the administration giving assistance packages to Ukraine, then Jim Jordan is not who you want as the House Majority Speaker. He's definitely not the guy. But luckily for those like myself who don't want to see him there, in the first round of votes, he lacked 22 votes from Republicans. No, 20 votes from Republicans. And it went through to second round of votes, and he lacked 22. So actually it got even worse for him. It looks like he's not going to be able to convince those people to vote for him because he's losing the votes. Obviously, he's not going to. He definitely won't get the Democrat votes at all. There won't be anyone that crosses the aisle to vote for him. So there needs to be. You're hearing some Republicans say we need to just start again. We need to just, do something different here, and that may be getting some kind of moderate in that isn't too offensive for any side, that is much more acceptable, maybe even for the Democrats. That person might get a bunch of votes from the Democrats, but you might need to go for some maybe old school conservative who is just has the respect of a wider range of people. I don't know. It's really interesting, but that person needs to be voted in because this package, as far as I'm concerned, needs to go through. Okay, that's my analysis. You can disagree with it if you like in the thread below. Right. Putin has called the ATACMS transfer to Ukraine a mistake, admits that missiles pose an additional threat, and said yesterday that the US made a great mistake by providing Ukraine with ATACMS long-range missiles, which have reportedly dealt significant damage to Russian forces. Absolutely true. In fact, if we look into the details of this, so he's over in China at the moment for the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing. So this is China's economic geopolitical strategy and all the nations who want to be a part of that over there. So Putin said yesterday that the US made a great mistake by providing the ATACMS. Speaking at a press conference in Beijing, Putin admitted that newly provided weaponry creates an additional threat to Russian forces. However, the Kremlin's leader voiced confidence that the Russian military would be capable of repelling ATACMS strikes and that the long-range missiles were fundamentally incapable of changing the situation at the front. And finally, a greater mistake, which is not yet apparent, he says, but very important, is that the United States is increasingly drawn into this conflict. The United States is no more drawn in than it has been previously. It's just providing slightly different weapons. I mean, I don't know how you can make huge differentiations between F-16s being given the green light and ATACMS, but if you want to do that, go for it, Putin. So the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov thanked North Korea for its fundamental, unequivocal support in the war against Ukraine, Russian state media outlet RIA Novosti reported yesterday. He also expressed his appreciation for North Korea's recognition of Ukrainian territories that Russia has illegally annexed. Syria is the only other country that has recognized the illegal annexation, so that says all you need to know about those countries. But it's interesting that Lavrov has thanked North Korea quite explicitly, because the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has denied that North Korea is supplying Russia with weapons. So thanks for all your support, even though you're not supporting us. Sweden edges closer to sending Gripen fighter jets to Ukraine. This is absolutely fantastic. I don't know how much concrete substance there is to this Politico article. Sweden edges closer to sending Gripen fighter jets to Ukraine. Defense Minister Paul Jonsson said earlier this month he had instructed Swedish military leadership to examine the potential impact of providing various types of support to Ukraine's fighter jet capability, including exporting or donating Gripen planes. The military is to report back by November the 6th, Jonsson said. Quote, this analysis is going to need to look at how our defensive capabilities are affected, both our operative capability here and now and our long-term defense finances, he told reporters in Stockholm. The F-16 decisions are making the Gripen's deployment an active point of discussion. Stefan Ungerth, a specialist on air defense at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, called it a matter of time. In other words, it will happen. And I said this months ago. So when Sweden said we will start looking at training Ukrainian pilots on the Gripen, you're not going to do that unless you're not planning on giving Gripens to Sweden. It will happen. Like you don't train Ukrainian pilots to go, oh, do you know what? We're not going to bother doing that now. Also, it's in the best interest of the Swedish defense industry, Saab in particular here, to get Ukraine using it. I mean, here is the advertising. This is marketing gold for someone like Saab, which is, okay, we haven't really sold enough Gripens around the world. Yeah, Brazil and Hungary use them, and they are well-regarded planes, but compared to the power of the industrial might of the American industrial military complex, we are going to struggle to market these as successfully. Ukraine comes along, as in the war comes along, and here's your opportunity to provide Gripens, which are designed to fight Russian aircraft. These are more perfect than the F-16. They can take off from roads. They don't suck up FOD from the like foreign object debris, like crapola from the airstrips. They don't suck them up into the engines as easily. They can use meteor weapons. Just really good airframes for Ukraine. Saab are going to be chomping at the bit for these to go to Ukraine, and the Swedish government will be, I know they're talking about finances, but this will be financially, I think, beneficial, because it not only advertises these to, it's not only the case of Ukraine taking these and the money that might be involved in that, especially if they sell them rather than donate them. It's going to be saying to the rest of the world, look how good these if they succeed, right? Look how good these airframes are. Anyone else want a piece of this? And Saab would be like, yeah, thank you very much. Anyway, if Sweden were to decide to send jets, experts suggest it could take up to a year before they're flying over Ukraine, as pilots and engineers would need training on its unfamiliar systems. I mean, there are some theories that, as I've said, that's already happening. Still, the planes could have a big impact. Quote, even a relatively small number of planes, say 10, would be of great benefit both operatively and in terms of morale for Ukraine, Ungerth said. I absolutely agree. But in Sweden, as in other so then there's a few paragraphs on how other countries are wavering in their support, financial support and whatnot. But in Sweden, as in other Nordic countries and across the Baltic states, where geographical proximity to Russia has heightened security fears, there is little sign of any wavering. Support for supplying arms to Ukraine among Sweden's citizens is among the strongest in Europe, polling suggests. And in his comments, Defence Minister Jonsson doubled down on his government's commitment. I know there is an understanding that the ground is shaking under the international coalition, but that isn't my understanding, Jonsson said. It is important now that we are among several countries to step up their support, and our 14th support package should be seen as a signal of the deep Swedish engagement to long-term and sustainable support. So I think that's really super important. Both the government and the Social Democrats have added one caveat, though, saying Sweden must be a member of NATO and party to its mutual defence commitments before it can risk sending any Gripens. Sweden's NATO membership is still being held up by Turkey and Hungary. There is some politicking to do there still, and that could be somewhat challenging for Ukraine getting hold of these airframes. Right. The Russians en masse bring Soviet Grozdika self-propelled guns to the temporarily occupied Yevpatoria. The movement of enemy equipment, so this is into Crimea, was recorded by Atesh partisans. It is noted that due to the serious losses of the Russian Federation, the occupiers are forced to resort to the use of outdated equipment again. So here we have self-propelled guns that are pretty old being shipped into Crimea. En masse, I mean, that in that footage we are seeing 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 self-propelled guns, which is half a day's worth of attrition, as according to latest figures, maybe even less than that. So I don't know if there's a larger consignment that's not in that footage, but it's not particularly something for the Ukrainians to be hugely afraid of. Now, talking about military aid, I was listening to Ukraine, the latest podcast, literally just now when I was trying to get my internet sorted. And there was an interview, or they were referencing an interview that they did with some Ukrainians fighting on the front line who were using an L11, is it the L119 UK provided howitzer that fires a particular type of shell, 105mm shell probably. And they basically run out the shells, and they only have 5 a week. So they're now trundling out their old Soviet D-44, like Stalin-era howitzers to use, because they can't use what is a better, accurate. They love it. It's a great howitzer. Thank you very much. Really good. Happy with this. But we don't have the shells. And this goes back to NATO saying we're scraping the bottom of the barrel, and all these nations saying, right, we need to make shells. But this is having an effect. So those counter-offensive stockpiles seem to have dwindled that they were gathering for this counter-offensive, and there is a desperate need for shells. Maybe not across all types of shells, as you can see from the interview, or I'm telling you, they are weeding out old Soviet howitzers because they have shells for them. Okay, so there are some shells, but certain types they are really struggling for. So that will be a challenge for the Ukrainians, as I think it's a challenge for both nations, with Russia drawing from North Korean reserves. Then if North Korea are providing other nations with them as well. And also I was listening to an analysis by CJ on Andrew Perpetua's live stream last night, talking about how if you're fighting a 10 million, and I did this analysis a couple of weeks ago, didn't I, with that infographic. If you're fighting a 10 million shell a year war, and you're broadly run out of shells, and you can only make however many, 800,000 a year or whatever it is, even 1 million a year, then that's a massive shortfall. You aren't going to get that from North Korea. North Korea have a load of shells, but they also are worried about South Korea, and there's no way they're going to go, yeah, you're fighting a 10 million shell a year war, we're going to give you 10 million shells. That ain't going to happen. So North Korea will provide Russia with some shells, but they're not going to be able to execute the kind of war that they have done over the last year. They have also seen a degradation of their barrels, so the accuracy and the range of those armaments that are firing those shells has been degraded. And So they can't fire as many, and what they do fire won't be as good. And they're using North Korean munitions. We're not really sure of the quality of them. So, like I said many times, the Russian situation is one of being constantly degraded. They will not be in a stronger position tomorrow as they are today. And a day after that, they will be in a less strong position. It is going in one direction, Russians. That is not a music reference. Or maybe it can be. No reports. Russia and China signed the largest contract. So this is onto geopolitical stuff. Largest contract in their history for the supply of grain to China, valued at 25.7 billion. So China has had an interest in Ukraine. It owns, or at least leases, a good deal of its agricultural land, which is partly why I have suggested before they are not a big fan of Russia using nuclear warheads in the area, because that will actually affect their food imports. But they need to get diversification to their portfolio. So signing a big grain deal with Russia, that is one of the breadbaskets of the world as well, is important. China have a huge population, and feeding them is one of their number one priorities. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russia has stolen millions of tons of Ukrainian grain in occupied territory. So that's an added complication there. They've signed this massive grain deal. There's no doubt that Russia will be intending that some of that Ukrainian grain will be part of that package. Zelensky has had a conversation with the Prime Minister of Norway, Jonas Gahr Støre. I thanked him for the recent military assistance package. We discussed the developments in the front and the priority defense needs of Ukraine. We discussed further strengthening of our military, in particular air defense to protect critical infrastructure and the Black Sea grain corridor, the president of Ukraine notes. In fact, let's dip into some analysis on Zelensky. So this is an interview with Professor James Carafano, just a foreign policy expert, with Ukraine the latest. Let's join him. He goes on to talk about Zelensky after this initial part. And actually, the few minutes before this is really good, but I didn't want to go on too long.
We often talk about, when will Russia sue for peace? I don't know. The reality is I think, to be fair, every day the Russians fight, the Russians are weaker than the day before.
Just what I was saying earlier. So, yeah.
They can have deals with North Korea and China and whatever and Iran and evade sanctions, but none of that's going to be sufficient to rebuild the level of combat power they would really need to be a serious threat to the future of Ukraine. Like I said, I think it's commonly recognized in the West interest to have a free and independent Ukraine. But I think the model will be the fighting will end. There'll be a line. There won't be a permanent peace. People keep talking about land for peace. That's not what's going on here. It's not going to be land for peace, right? Because there's no amount of land that the Russians would get that they'd ever be satisfied with. And even if Ukraine gained back every inch of Ukrainian territory, the Russians might attack again, right? So this is not a land for peace formula. This is a peace that's going to be based on conventional deterrence. So we all talk about Putin, but I actually think the real actor here is Zelensky. And I say that because Zelensky has to balance kind of three things, and how he manages them is going to really determine how the future unfolds. One, of course, is prosecuting the war. I don't think there's a scenario where Zelensky could not go on the offensive. That after all the blood and sacrifice and everything else, the notion that they wouldn't fight to take back Ukrainian territory, I don't see how Ukrainians would have ever accepted that. So there was always going to be some kind of counteroffensive. How successful it is yet, I don't know. But a counteroffensive can't go on to the point that it actually compromises the future ability of Ukraine to defend itself. The second is politics. He can't put off an election forever. In the end, that will actually undermine political stability in the country, obviously, because he's a politician. He's going to want to call elections when it puts his government in the strongest position possible to do that. And the third is he has to set conditions for negotiations. And it's not about setting conditions with the Russians. It's about getting alignment among all your key partners and allies in support for your negotiating position. And so he's got to manage those three things. And how he chooses to manage them will really determine how strong a hand Ukrainians have when they go to the table. I don't think that this is going to be a Yalta 2. my presumption was that if Russians went to the table, the first thing they want is this big, expansive deal that would essentially give them everything in the peace treaty that they didn't get in the war. And their notion is so people are so sick and tired of the war, they'll just give us what we want. I don't think that's going to happen. So this deal's probably going to be, if it is even a formal deal and not just kind of a cessation of hostility, it's going to be relatively limited. I know there are people that would like to bring Moldova into this.
And he goes on to talk about Moldova, and that's really interesting. But it's going to be about deterrence, about being in a position so that because what he was talking about is that you kind of you choose to attack or not due to several things. One is geographical limits. So if you're backed against the Ural Mountains or the Suez Canal or wherever it is, okay, we can't fight past there or whatever. There isn't that around Ukraine, so that's not an issue. So it's about deterrence, and Ukraine needs to be in a position where they are too much of a deterrence to Russia to attack in too good a situation. And that's going to be down to, obviously, international assistance in terms of arms. It's going to come down to how they fare on the battlefield now, and so on and so forth. So a really good interview that was. So much I'd love to dip into, but anyway, I must move on. So also, just one more thing on that, actually, talk about elections and what Zelensky does about elections going forward, whether there is a genuine threat to him with internal politicking inside Ukraine. So I'll probably dip into that in the next show going forward. EU official said Ukrainian refugees help European labour shortages. The Ukrainians have reduced labour shortages and improved employment rates in many EU countries, according to the European Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights, Nicolas Schmidt. The latest figures show that 1.87 million Ukrainians in 19 EU countries have signed an employment contract. So that is good news for assimilation, for Ukrainians to find a new home in this time of need for them, but also helping the countries they're in. There have been some issues of cohesion and so on and so forth, so it doesn't come without challenges, of course. And this is good news. So Georgian Parliament has failed to impeach President Salome Zurabishvili. The ruling Georgian Dream Party did not receive enough votes to launch the presidential impeachment process. So the attempt to impeach her was because she went to the EU to, meet with other politicians and talk about the EU, because Georgia do have intentions to accede to the EU. For some reason, that riled the increasingly pro-Russian, pro-Kremlin Georgian Dream Party that nominally, at least initially, was pro-EU. I mean, they got elected on that kind of mandate. They seem to have reneged on that and turned much more towards the Kremlin. And with the president doing what a president should be doing, they took offence to that and attempted impeachment proceedings, which luckily, I think, in my opinion, have failed. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate your support. Take care. I'll speak to you soon.